If you grew up on 16-bit classics or PS1 RPGs and missed the feeling of games that trusted you to figure things out, this list is for you. These are newer pixel and pixel-adjacent games that didn't just copy the aesthetics of the past. They actually understood what made those games matter. 14 of them. Some you know, some you don't. All worth your time. Alabaster Dawn is the most recent game on this list and still finding its audience, but it belongs here. It draws from old-school dungeon RPGs and early CRPGs with a pixel art presentation that feels genuinely weathered, like something recovered from a lost archive rather than designed to look retro. The tone matches that aesthetic: bleak, sparse, deliberately unglamorous. Combat leans into turn-based strategy with a positioning layer that makes small skirmishes feel like real decisions. Enemy types punish careless movement, and resource management stays tight enough that even mid-level encounters carry actual stakes. There's no inflating your stats past the point of tension. The difficulty holds throughout without feeling artificial or padded. World building arrives in fragments. Notes, environmental details, unreliable narrator passages. It builds something coherent over time without ever holding your hand toward it. Some players will find that approach tedious, especially early on when the lack of orientation can feel more alienating than immersive. The interface also has rough edges that reflect its scale of development. But Alabaster Dawn has the quality that old masterpieces almost always had: a distinct perspective. It isn't trying to be for other games at once. It knows what it is, and it commits to that fully. In a genre crowded with competent games, that kind of identity is harder to find than it should be. Infernax doesn't apologize for being hard, and that's the right call. Modeled directly after old NES action platformers, Castlevania 2 and Zelda 2 especially, it brings back that punishing, deliberate style of movement-based combat and treats it as a feature rather than an obstacle. Every hit you take feels earned, and every death teaches you something specific about the situation you misread. What makes it more than just a nostalgia exercise is the moral choice system. Decisions you make throughout the game, whether to help or exploit NPCs, which paths you take, how you respond to certain events, lead to genuinely different outcomes. Multiple endings exist, and reaching them requires real engagement with the systems rather than a single choice near the end. The tone shifts alongside your decisions, too. Certain routes go considerably darker than others in ways the opening doesn't hint at. It is intentionally retro in ways that some players will love and others won't. The NES-style presentation is committed and detailed, but the difficulty will push away players who didn't grow up with that kind of punishment loop. Some boss patterns also require very specific approaches that aren't clearly telegraphed on first encounter. But for players with patience and affection for that era, Infernax is a tightly designed throwback that actually has something original to say, which is rarer than it sounds in this genre. Hyperlight Drifter communicates almost entirely through imagery, and that decision shapes everything about the experience. There's no text-heavy dialogue, no exposition, just visual fragments, environment design, and sound that together build a picture of a civilization that has already ended. It's confident in a way that few games are, trusting players to construct meaning from what they observe rather than what they're explicitly told. Combat is fast, aggressive, and heavily dash-dependent. Everything flows through mobility. You dash through attacks, dash into melee range, dash out before counter lands. The rhythm takes time to internalize, but once it clicks, encounters feel more like choreography than attrition. There's a brutality to the difficulty that feels appropriate for what the game is saying about decay and futility, even when individual sections are punishing. Navigation trips some players up. The world is open and largely unmarked, and certain areas withhold their structure until you've failed to find the right path several times. That's intentional, but it doesn't always feel like purposeful design versus friction for its own sake. The story is also entirely open to interpretation, which some will love and others will find unsatisfying. For me, the ambiguity felt earned. It's a game about loss and the end of things, and leaving questions unresolved felt honest to that. Signalis is not easy to categorize, and that's part of what makes it so effective. It's a survival horror game with pixel art that borrows from Resident Evil's fixed camera structure and Silent Hill's psychological layering. But the aesthetic and the story belong entirely to their own thing. Something that draws from East German retrofuturism, android identity, and grief in a way that feels genuinely literary rather than genre mashup. Resource management is deliberate and often stressful. Inventory is strictly limited, enemies respawn, and the environment is disorienting in ways that mirror the protagonist's fractured mental state. The puzzles are cryptic in the good sense. They ask you to pay attention, to take notes, to actually engage with the world rather than run through it. I found myself genuinely writing things down, which almost nothing outside of old survival horror makes me do anymore. It's not for players who want forward momentum and clear objectives. The pacing is slow, the narrative is fragmented by design, and understanding what's happening requires active interpretation rather than passive absorption. Some players will find that exhilarating. Others will bounce off it entirely. But for anyone who connects with it, Signalis is one of the most genuinely unsettling and emotionally resonant games made in the last decade. It has something real to say, and it says it through every layer of its design rather than just its dialogue. Blasphemous 2 comes out of the gate knowing exactly what it wants to be, and it executes with confidence. Where the first game was built around a single weapon and a brutal rhythm, the sequel gives you 3 weapons with distinct mechanics and the ability to swap mid-combat. That change alone opens up the design considerably. Enemies that resist one approach demand another, and learning when to shift between your tools becomes a genuine skill layer rather than a cosmetic choice. The art direction is as striking as ever. Grotesque religious imagery, architecture that feels ancient and oppressive, and animations that give enemy designs a sense of physical weight that cheaper art styles can't replicate. The world feels built for its aesthetic rather than around a checklist, and that commitment shows in every area. Some locations are genuinely arresting in ways that linger after you've finished and moved on. Traversal gets real room to breathe this time. Aerial movement options and the new weapon abilities combine in ways that make the map more interesting to navigate, though some areas still feel more like corridors than interconnected space. A few boss designs also telegraph patterns poorly on first encounter, relying on repetition to teach rather than visual clarity. Those moments aside, Blasphemous 2 is exactly what a sequel to that first game should be. Wider, more generous with its systems, and just as uncompromising in its atmosphere. Chained Echoes opens with a warship crashing mid-battle and doesn't really slow down from there. It's a love letter to 16-bit JRPGs, specifically the kind that had enormous worlds, dense combat mechanics, and stories that weren't afraid to get complicated. What's surprising is how well it earns that comparison rather than just borrowing surface-level aesthetics. One developer built this entire thing, which makes its scope feel almost unreasonable. Combat uses an overdrive gauge that punishes both passivity and recklessness. You get rewarded for staying in an optimal zone, deal too much damage without rotating abilities, and you overheat, taking penalties. It creates this constant pressure that keeps even random encounters engaging, which most JRPGs completely fail at. The skill system layers on top, letting you customize builds in ways that actually change how fights play out rather than just inflating your numbers. Where it stumbles slightly is pacing in the second half. The story has a lot of moving parts, political conspiracies, ancient weapons, multiple factions, and not all of it lands with the same weight as the opening. Some characters get sidelined once their individual arc closes out, but the world stays compelling throughout, and the sheer amount of content packed into this release is genuinely staggering. Chained Echoes is one of the best things to happen to the JRPG genre in years.
Huh?
Octopath Traveler 2 takes the bones of the first game and addresses the parts that frustrated people most. The storytelling improves, not just because individual chapters are stronger, but because the characters now actually interact with each other in ways that make the world feel cohesive rather than 8 disconnected episodes running in parallel. That was the original's central weakness, and the sequel genuinely worked on it. The day and night mechanic adds meaningful texture to exploration. Different NPCs, events, and story beats are only accessible at certain times, and some path actions function exclusively at night. It rewards paying attention to the world rather than just sprinting through it. Combined with the improved job class combinations and the latent power system, the combat has real depth, and unlike the first game, the difficulty scaling feels like it was actually considered. The pixel art is extraordinary. Each character has their own visual palette and environmental theme, and the depth of field lighting effects on backgrounds give the game a visual identity that no other pixel RPG quite matches. Where it still struggles is the uneven chapter quality across the 8 protagonists. Some stories are gripping and emotionally resonant. Others feel like they wrap up before they fully develop. The ceiling here is higher than the first games, though, and so is the floor.
Particio?
Crosscode has no business being as good as it is. An indie game that manages to feel like a lost Sega RPG, a puzzle dungeon masterwork, and a character-driven story all at once. It shouldn't work as cleanly as it does. But somehow it does, and it maintains that quality consistently across a runtime longer than most full-budget JRPGs. You play as Leah, an amnesiac player character inside a fictional MMO, and the meta layer of that premise is used cleverly rather than as a crutch. The world reflects MMO design, zones, combat arenas, elemental affinities, but the dungeons are where Crosscode separates itself entirely. Environmental puzzles scale in complexity in a way that felt genuinely satisfying to work through, requiring lateral thinking rather than pattern recognition alone. Combat is fast, reactive, and builds toward a flow state once you understand the melee and ranged mechanics together. The rhythm of switching elements and closing distance feels like a scaled-down action RPG in the best way. My main complaint is that the early game introduces systems a bit too rapidly, and some players bounce before the pacing settles. The middle sections are also occasionally padded, but the highs more than compensate. Crosscode is one of those games that earns genuine respect the longer you spend with it, and the longer you spend with it, the more you realize how much thought went into every system. Owlboy spent 9 years in development, and you can feel that care in every corner of it. Nothing here feels accidental. The pixel art is extraordinary. The combat integrates into the flight mechanics in a way that feels natural, and the emotional beats land with a weight that most games triple its budget don't manage to reach. The production values feel personal rather than just polished. You play as Otis, a mute owl student who carries other characters to use their abilities in combat and traversal. The mechanic sounds simple, but creates surprising variety. Different companions handle completely differently, and swapping between them based on situation gives the game a puzzle-flavored rhythm throughout combat encounters. The world rewards exploration with visual storytelling and secrets that feel genuinely worth finding rather than padding out the map. The campaign is shorter than you might expect, given the development timeline, and the final act rushes through some emotional resolutions that deserve more space. Players who get invested will feel those gaps. But the rest of the game is so thoughtful and so beautifully realized that they feel minor in context. Owlboy is a love letter to classic gaming made by people who actually understood what they loved. Not just the look of old games, but the feeling of being completely absorbed in a small world that manages to feel enormous. Time Spinner is the kind of Metroidvania that clearly knows its inspirations inside and out. The time stop mechanic that lets you freeze enemies and projectiles in place is immediately satisfying, and it feeds directly into both combat and traversal in ways that feel natural rather than gimmicky. Enemies become platforms. Attacks become openings. The whole system has that quality where you keep finding new uses for hours in. The story is also unusually ambitious for a game of this scale. There are political factions, generational trauma, and time travel consequences that actually follow through on their implications. The world building goes deeper than the runtime technically demands, and I appreciated that the game trusted players to engage with it rather than simplifying things for accessibility. It respects your intelligence in a way that a lot of indie games at this budget level don't. The map design is solid, but occasionally frustrating. There are moments where the game withholds enough information that backtracking feels more tedious than mysterious. Combat can also feel a bit unbalanced in places. Once you find a strong, familiar combination, it stays strong for much of the game without requiring you to adapt. Neither issue is severe enough to undercut the overall experience, but they're worth knowing going in. Time Spinner does exactly what a good Metroidvania should. Gives you a world worth exploring and tools that make exploring it feel rewarding. Children of Morta reframes the roguelite structure around family, and that framing matters more than it sounds like it should. You're playing through the story of the Bergson family, each member a playable character with a distinct play style, and the narrative wraps around runs rather than existing separately from them. Deaths, upgrades, and story progression all accumulate together, treating the family as living characters rather than just mechanical options. Each family member handles completely differently. The eldest son is a defensive brawler. The archer daughter plays at range with high mobility. The grandmother uses fire magic with wide splash damage. Getting comfortable with all of them across different story moments keeps the variety high throughout a full playthrough, and the passive upgrades shared across the family give each run a sense of momentum even when you fail. The pixel art leans into motion. Characters animate with a weight and expressiveness that matches the emotional stakes the game keeps building. Work and drag is late-game dungeon repetition. Some zone design leans on the same layouts too heavily, and elite enemies in later areas occasionally feel more tedious than challenging. The story earns genuine emotional investment despite that. There are moments in this game that hit harder than they have any right to, and that's rare for a genre that usually keeps narrative at arm's length. Sea of Stars wears its Chrono Trigger love openly, and that's both its biggest strength and the thing people debate most about it. Visually, it's stunning, probably the best-looking pixel art game on this list. The environments are lush, the lighting is dynamic, and every area feels handcrafted to the point where you slow down just to look around instead of rushing to the next objective. It sets a visual bar that few pixel games have cleared. The turn-based combat is tight and interactive. Timed hits and blocks add a rhythm to battles that keeps you paying attention, and the Eclipse mechanic, where you break enemies' color-coded locks using the right damage type, adds genuine strategy to fights that could have easily felt rote. I found myself actually thinking about party composition, which older JRPGs often made feel optional rather than meaningful to the outcome. The story is where opinions split. It's warm and earnest, but leans heavily on tone over depth. Characters are likable, but mostly uncomplicated, and some players will find the lack of real narrative tension a deal breaker after a certain point in the game. For me, that earnestness was part of the appeal. It doesn't try to be dark or subversive. It just wants to be a good adventure. Whether that's enough depends entirely on what you're looking for. The journey itself is beautiful from start to finish regardless of where you land on the story. Eastward is the kind of game that surprises you with how much it cares. On the surface, it's a Zelda-style action RPG with a post-apocalyptic setting and two character mechanics: a big, silent man named Sam and a mysterious girl named Chungsu. The further you get, the clearer it becomes that the real heart of this game is the relationship between those two, not the world-ending threat behind them. Visually, it's remarkable. The pixel art has a warmth and specificity that reminds me of late SNES animation, but with a color depth and expressiveness that goes beyond what that hardware could ever do. Environments feel lived in. Kitchens with actual clutter, towns with layered backgrounds, light that shifts as you move between areas. The art direction alone earns it a place on this list, and there are moments where you stop purely to appreciate a background. Combat is functional, but not the main draw. It's competent without being exceptional, and there are stretches where the pacing slows down more than it should. The game also includes a fully playable retro RPG within the game called Earthborn, which is charming the first time you encounter it, but can disrupt momentum when it reappears. None of that is a deal breaker. Eastward's tone and its character writing carry it through the slower stretches. It's one of the few pixel games in recent years that actually made me feel something by the end. The Messenger starts as a straight ninja Gaiden homage. Tight controls, aggressive enemies, a dark fantasy setting, and that satisfying momentum you get from nailing a run of platforming challenges without breaking stride. It's excellent at that. And then, about halfway through, it completely changes what kind of game it is, and what follows is something else entirely. That shift is the best thing about it, and I won't say more. What I will say is that the writing earns the structural twist through consistent humor and a self-awareness that never becomes exhausting. The shopkeeper character alone has more wit than most full game scripts I've sat through. The game clearly enjoyed writing him, and you feel that every time he shows up. Movement is where the messenger really delivers regardless of which half you're in. The cloud step mechanic, where you extend air time by hitting projectiles or enemies mid-jump, gives traversal a rhythm that becomes deeply satisfying to master. The game keeps introducing new combinations and obstacles without overcomplicating what the core controls can do, and that restraint is part of why the feel stays so good throughout. The post-twist section shifts the pacing, and a handful of late-game backtracking sequences lose momentum in ways the first half never did. But none of that undoes how fun the game is to actually move through. For fans of classic action platformers, it's one of the most complete packages available.